In this video, I'll be walking you guys through my entire 3-month Saas journey, all the way from learning JavaScript to deploying a finished software onto the internet. I'll be breaking down exactly what I did, the steps I took, and things that I could have done better in order to make the process smoother and shorter. So if you have any interest in starting a software of your own, this will be an educational video so that you can learn how you can get it done in a much shorter period than I did with fewer mistakes. Let's go ahead and get into the video. I broke the whole project into 7 parts so that I cover everything, but I don't yap too much on any specific part. Before I get into the actual project, I just wanted to give some context to actually what I built. So it's basically an application that allows creators or business owners to manage people sharing content on their behalf. In this account, I have like dummy data, but this is an example. These would be all the videos that people who would sign up for the program had posted. They can sign up for the program using a link that you get when you create a program in this screen. Then in this screen you can check analytics. You can see who all's signed up. And then you can also create challenges, and you can also track the progress as far as views driven towards the goal. This is one half of the application. This is the creator slash business owner side, and then the other side is the distributor side. But this is just to give some context towards what I built. So let's go ahead and start with my background. Before I started the project, I did know Java and Python, but I barely had any JavaScript experience. Did actually go to college for computer science, so it seems like I would know how to do everything, but going to college for computer science does not actually teach you how to build web applications of any sort. If you go to college for computer science, they'll mainly teach you stuff like algorithms, data structures, computing theory, stuff like that, which is useful. Definitely did help me in learning and picking up JavaScript and learning how to build web apps. But you definitely don't need it, and plenty of people teach themselves how to code web apps, teach themselves React.js, Node.js without going to college for computer science. Definitely don't need it. Yeah, that was my background. I definitely needed to learn React.js and Node.js. If you've never heard of them, React.js is basically what people use to build the front end of most web applications, which is basically it's a combination of JavaScript and HTML. And then Node.js is basically straight JavaScript. It's the back end. It's what runs the logic to make these apps work. I needed to learn both of these. I decided to do this like everybody else by going to YouTube and finding a project. Found a dude named Llamadev. He was doing some sort of booking app clone. So I basically just followed along, did this tutorial almost every day, but every couple of days. Probably took me about 2 months, maybe 2 months and a couple of weeks to get it finished. Just doing 15 minutes a day, every day or every couple of days. Basically did that to get a feel for React.js building and just to learn all the different things. I learned about components, I learned about React hooks, stuff like that, which is very important, but we'll get into that later on in the video. That was the first learning step, was to follow along and do that project. The second learning step I took was making sure that I could do it on my own. So I did my own little self-directed project, which was basically where it was like a storefront for beats, because I used to make beats, used to be a producer, but I basically made a beat store to where I could upload the beats. I used a Firebase database in order to store the beats and images, and then basically built a web app around just showing these beats, playing these beats if people clicked on them. And then I also implemented Stripe so that people could pay. So that was my second project. I did that one completely on my own just to make sure that I followed along and I actually retained the information. But knowing what I know now, I might not have even done that second one, but I'll talk about that later when I talk about how I would do things differently. 2 announcements for those actually interested in really getting started in building a SaaS. One, if you're not technical and you're not interested in learning at all, and you'd rather just pay the money and have a software development agency handle it for you, there will be a Calendly link in the description so that you can book a call and talk with me about what you want to build. The next announcement is for those who are interested in building their SaaS themselves, but might want a little bit of extra help or a little extra guidance. There'll also be a Discord link below, and you can join and ask me questions and get any feedback you need for your journey. All right, let's get back to the video. The next step was ideation. Had my first 2 projects out the way, but I basically was ready for a real SaaS that I was going to actually try to deploy and make money off of. Thought about what I had learned so far, what my skill set entailed, and basically what I could build, what type of problems I could solve for a certain niche that I was familiar with. So I basically thought about the different niches I was familiar with. It wasn't too many. Had an agency at the time. I was thinking about doing something for an agency. Also had a YouTube channel separate from this one. So I was thinking about something for creators. Ended up picking the clip controller idea, basically a platform where any type of creator or business could basically leverage their audience or their customer base and get them to share short form content and also track the content they're sharing and the views they're getting. And basically just took this idea and ran with it. I didn't do any type of validation, which I definitely would do in the future. And once again, I'll talk about that more when I talk about how I would do things differently. So this is the full project scope, just to explain why things went the way they went. It was 33 components. If you're not familiar with the component, it's basically like a piece of code. It's like a piece of the page. A button could be a component. A sidebar could be a component. So it was 33 components. You reuse these components across different pages. It was 21 different pages. It was only really 8 real pages where actual functionality is going on. The rest is stuff like a pricing page, a sign up page, a login page, forgot password page, stuff like that. The majority of the logic for the backend was in server actions in a particular action file. And this file had 2,300 lines of code, so a decent amount of backend logic. It was a bigger project, and I wouldn't really recommend that for somebody just starting out or somebody like trying to iterate quickly and get out a bunch of ideas and figure out what sticks. I'd recommend like a smaller project. But once again, I'll get into that at the end of the video. So that's basically how that was the size of the project. Actually getting into the project, the main things that I had to learn was basically Next.js. Leading up to this project, the framework I was using was Vite. That's what I learned in that tutorial. But Next.js is basically the standard one that people use if they're going to deploy like a multi-page application. So I had to learn Next, learn that on the fly. But with Next, you have to learn things like server components versus client components. Certain logic runs server side, certain logic runs client side. If you try to run server side logic, client side, then bad things happen. So basically had to get that down. Had to really get a good grasp on React.js hooks, really understanding like how they work, how all the components fit together. That's a very important part of learning React.js, is basically learning how all the components fit together and the logic to make everything work. That was definitely a big part of the project. I used ChatGPT a lot for the project. So the thing that I searched for the most on ChatGPT was basically using CSS in order to style the project. So it would basically be like, how do I style this section a certain way? How do I space out the div? How do I center the div? Just figuring out how to structure the CSS in the way I wanted in order to make the application look how I wanted it to look. And then lastly, external APIs were a big part. I used YouTube and TikTok, so I basically had to do a couple searches on how to make sure I was querying the information that I needed the proper way in order to get the results to display on the web app. So that was the full project. I started out relatively light, doing about 2 to 4 hours a day in the first couple weeks. And then probably after the first month passed, I got more serious about it and started basically spending about 6 to 8 hours a day working on coding the project. until I eventually finished. After I finished, I decided to go with Vercel to deploy it. A couple of different options that you can use to deploy your app. You can use NetSuite, you can use AWS. NetSuite and Vercel are basically pretty similar as far as how you deploy it, but Vercel is the more popular option. Vercel is actually, they're the ones behind the Next.js framework. AWS is cheaper, but it's more complex to set up. And being that this was my first time deploying a project, I just decided to go with Vercel. So I chose Vercel and I began the process of deploying, and I immediately ran into lint and ES errors. So these are big when you're trying to deploy. And basically, the solution is basically to run npm run build in your production environment instead of trying to run it on Vercel and look at the Vercel logs. And once I figured this out, went through, fixed all the errors that I needed to fix, and got it deployed on Vercel. And that was it for the project. Now, how I would do this project different if I were to do it again is, one, I would validate the idea first, because I did spend 3 months working on this project and had no idea whether the idea was actually useful, if people needed it or anything like that. It was a learning project, but there's still an opportunity cost because I could have been learning, working on something that would have actually been more viable. So I would definitely say validate the idea first. Next, scope out the full project before building it. Be as detailed as you can with what you want to include as far as functionality so that you can get the most accurate picture as possible for what it's going to require. I definitely had no idea that my application was going to take 21 pages. So I definitely should have done a better job at scoping out the project. Next, I would skip the lead up project. Once again, the lead up project helped, but similarly to how I started the project, and it was my first project doing Next.js, I could have basically learned, like I learned Next.js on the fly. I could have just learned everything on the fly doing this project instead of doing the test project. And it would have slowed this project down, but the total amount would have been shorter than doing the lead up project before and then this project. So I probably, in the future, I would have just done the follow along project to get the fundamentals down and then started the actual project. And lastly, I would have read the React hook documentation while building the project, because hooks are a big part and I ran into a lot of problems basically just learning and figuring them out. So in the future, if I were to do it again and I didn't know, I lost all the knowledge and I had to learn it again, then I would definitely read the documentation while doing the actual project and actually implementing them. Because if you just try to read the documentation before you actually start building a project, it won't stick. But if you just try to learn it all on the fly, then you'll run into a lot of problems while you're learning. So I would read the documentation while I'm doing the project. So those are the main points. If you pick a smaller project, you could probably get it done much quicker. If you don't know any code, then there'll be a larger learning curve. You'll probably have to start with more basic projects than an actual web app just to learn the basics of coding, fundamentals like loops, basically object oriented, what that means, stuff like that. But that's basically the framework. I would still recommend following this basic process as far as taking learning steps, ideating your project, scoping it out, and then doing the project, and then eventually deploying. Once again, if you're interested in having a software development agency build your Saas for you, then book a call below. And if you're interested in getting some help and guidance along your Saas journey, then make sure to join that Discord link also in the description.